In 2009, popular true crime TV show Cops just happened to be in South Florida filming when a truly diabolical crime was committed there. And so cops captured this crime on camera. But someone in their footage was hiding something. And when you know what that something was, it becomes very obvious when you watch. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the like button if you can borrow their car for the week, and then when they say yes, spend that week driving around picking up as much roadkill as possible and packing it into their trunk. Picking up as much roadkill as you possibly can and pack it into their back seat in their trunk and then return the car. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Michael DiPolito grew up in a very rough neighborhood in South Philadelphia where violence, drugs, and prostitution were just normal parts of everyday life. At a young age, like his parents, Michael became an alcoholic. He also developed a very serious drug addiction that he paid for by selling drugs. Michael would eventually drop out of high school, and not long after that, he became homeless and was living out on the streets, sleeping in abandoned buildings at night to stay warm. In 1993, when Michael was still in South Philadelphia, he was arrested for the first time. He was charged with possession of an unknown drug as well as intent to distribute this unknown drug. Court records don't specify what drug this was. However, Michael just did not show up for court, and so a warrant was put out for his arrest. Michael would somehow manage to evade police capture, and by 1997, he had fled South Philly altogether and landed in South Florida in a town called Boca Raton. Shortly after arriving there, Michael was arrested for a second time, this time for offering an undercover police officer $15 in exchange for sex. Michael would plead guilty to soliciting prostitution, however, he would just get released. A year after the prostitution arrest, Michael was sued by a former girlfriend named Karen Tan, who claimed he was the father of her son, and so he owed her child support. And Karen had a DNA test that backed up this claim. However, Michael, again, would just not show up for court, and before long, Karen just gave up and dropped the lawsuit. Michael was likely very relieved when this happened, because at the time, he was making almost no money through a temp agency. And so after this lawsuit gets dropped, Michael decides, I need to go out and make some real money. And somehow, on his quest to find a more lucrative opportunity, Michael was introduced to associates of the Bonanno family. And the Bonanno family is one of the infamous 5 families that dominates organized crime across the United States. They are literally the Italian mafia. And after the mafia met Michael, they took a liking to him, and they did offer him a more lucrative, albeit illegal, opportunity. They gave him a role inside one of their so-called boiler rooms. A boiler room is not literally a boiler room. Instead, it's a group of fraudsters that use high-pressure sales tactics to steal money from unsuspecting victims. Typically, the way it works is the fraudster will cold call someone, and they will tell them that they have this great get-rich-quick scheme, but you gotta give me your money right now if you want to be a part of it. And so when the victim says, okay, that sounds great, and they wire the money along, the fraudster just steals their money. Michael, who was very charismatic and a natural salesman, got really good at tricking people into giving him their money. And so eventually, Michael realized he could make a lot more money if he started his own boiler room, where his commission could be much higher on the money he stole. And so fairly abruptly, he left the mafia's boiler room. We don't really know how they reacted to this, and Michael would set up not one, but 2 boiler room scams of his own in South Florida, and by 2002, he had pocketed $155,000 of stolen money. However, he had spent virtually all of it on fancy hotels and cars and phone sets. But the good times would not last for Michael, because in 2002, the police caught on to Michael's boiler room scams, and they raided them, and Michael was arrested for a third time, except this time he would go to court, he would stand trial, and he he would be sentenced to 2 years in prison, 28 years of probation, and he would be ordered to pay back the $155,000 that he stole. Michael would only serve 7 months of his 2-year jail sentence, but that was more than enough to leave a huge impact on him. Michael hated prison. He hated every second of it. And so during those long, sleepless nights that he was laying awake in his cell, he made a promise to himself that when he got out, when he was released, he would never, ever come back. And so in 2003, when he was released, he immediately entered a sobriety program. He also started going to the gym every morning, and he began studying for his GED, which is a high school equivalency test because he didn't get his high school diploma. After he successfully earned his GED a couple of months later, he would also start a legal business. It was a digital marketing firm that was called Mad Money Inc. Over the next several years, Michael would do his very best to stay on the straight and narrow and not get in trouble, and for the most part, he did that. By 2008, Michael was still sober, despite a few setbacks, and he was still very focused on his physical fitness and his health, and his business, Mad Money, was doing quite well, earning him nearly $100,000 a year. But his love life had become a bit messy. Michael had gotten married back in 2007 to his longtime girlfriend named Maria Luongo, who had stood by him when he went to jail. But that year, in 2008, when Michael was 38 years old, he cheated on Maria with a 26-year-old real estate agent named Dalia Mohammed, who he met at a Starbucks. And instead of their affair being a quick fling, as they likely both intended it to be, Michael and Dalia quickly fell in love. And when that happened, Michael went to his wife Maria and he told her, and then he divorced her. Just 3 days after the divorce finalized, Michael and Dalia went to the courthouse and they got married. The newlyweds would move into a brand new condo that Michael had purchased for them in Boynton Beach, which is a beautiful town in South Florida. And for a time, their life was perfect. They knew it was a little outrageous the way they had met each other and how quickly they had fallen for each other, but they didn't care. They got along great and they were excited about the future. But their perfect life would not last long. On the evening of March 12th, 2009, so only about a month after they had gotten married, Michael and Dalia were at home in their condo when they heard a knock on the front door. And so Michael went to the door, he opened it up, and much to his surprise, standing on the other side was his probation officer, and behind him was a whole bunch of police officers. And before Michael could even ask what was going on, the probation officer told Michael that they had received an anonymous call tipping them off that Michael was selling steroids and ecstasy pills and other drugs out of his condo. Michael would tell the probation officer that there was no way that was true. He is not selling any drugs, he's sober, he's not doing that. And so eventually Michael just stepped aside and said, "Please come in, search my condo, I have nothing to hide." And so sure enough, the police, they would go into his condo, they would search it, but they wouldn't find anything, and they would leave. And so after the police had gone, Michael and Dalia found themselves just standing in their condo, completely dumbfounded. But instead of trying to get to the bottom of it right then and there about who had called and why, they just decided it was best for them to just leave their condo for the night and go stay at a nice hotel. So they packed up some bags, they left their condo, which was a total mess from the police search, and they went to the hotel and they had a nice night together. The next morning, when they got up and headed down to the parking lot, they saw up ahead, standing around Michael's car, was Michael's probation officer as well as several other police officers. And so Michael and Dalia are looking at each other like, what is this, again? And so they hustle on over to Michael's car, and before they can even plead their innocence to Michael's probation officer, he stops Michael and just says, "Look, we got another anonymous call, this time telling us that you are selling drugs out of your vehicle, and so we need to search it." And so Michael is just totally beside himself, but he says, "Look, go ahead, search it, there's nothing in the car." And so sure enough, the police would open up his car, they'd rip it apart, but again, they wouldn't find anything. Over the next couple of weeks, the only thing Michael and Dalia ever wanted to talk about was what the heck was going on. Who is placing these anonymous calls claiming that Michael was selling drugs out of the condo and out of the car? It just didn't add up. They wanted to believe that this was all just one big mistake, but in the back of both of their minds, they were thinking about Michael's very checkered past and his previous dealings with the mafia and with people he had clearly ripped off. And so maybe there was someone in his past that was looking to get back at Michael and maybe get him arrested and sent back to jail. Fast forward to March 29th, so 17 days after that first raid on their condo. And that night, Michael and Dahlia had been eating dinner at a restaurant, and when they left and headed out to the parking lot, once again, standing around Michael's car were several police officers clearly waiting for him to return. And so without even needing to ask why they were there, Michael and Dahlia, they go over to them and they just start pleading with them to understand that this is a setup. We do not have drugs in this car. We don't know what's going on here. Please, you gotta understand that someone's doing this to us. But this time, when they searched his car, they would find something. Before we go any further, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Experian. Back when I was just a young buck in college, I was broke. And so naturally, I took out a credit card with a $5,000 limit and immediately maxed it out on buffalo chicken calzones and beer. Now, as soon as my card got declined, I didn't pay it off. Instead, I just took the card, tucked it back into my wallet, and forgot about it. But the bank did not forget about my $5,000 debt, and my failure to pay it back wrecked my FICO score. A FICO score is a type of credit score. Over the last 10 years, I've been able to rebuild my credit score, but it has been a slow and painful process. And so my suggestion to you is to avoid the unpaid beer and calzone credit trap and just closely monitor your credit score. And with Experian, you can do that for free. In addition to closely monitoring your credit score, they will also send you alerts anytime your credit changes. Experian also offers a dark web scan. If you've ever been the victim of a data breach, and you may not know if you have or not, your information potentially could live in the dark web. And that's a place where criminals could use it to commit fraud, and if that happens, it'll wreck your credit along with a bunch of other horrible things, unless you catch it and report it. And on that, if you do find inaccuracies on your credit report, you can easily submit disputes and track those disputes on Experian's online dispute center. It is time to take charge of your credit. Get Experian credit monitoring, alerts, your FICO score, and that dark web scan all for free. Just go to Experian.com/Mr. Ballin. Again, that's EXPERIAN.com/Mr. Ballin. Okay, back to the story. After searching Michael's car, the police would find a small bag of cocaine stuck inside of a cigarette carton tucked underneath his spare tire in the trunk. And when Michael saw them pull the cocaine out, he began to cry because he knew, even though it was not his and he had not put it there, that he was going to jail because he was going to get arrested for possession and he was on probation and he was screwed. And so he just begins crying and pleading with police to understand that the cocaine was not his. He swears it's not his. Meanwhile, Dahlia, she's looking at the drugs and now she's second guessing herself. Is Michael lying? Is he actually selling drugs and he's been lying to me too? But when she sees her husband crying hysterically and looking so sincere, she believes that he's got to be telling the truth. And so pretty soon she was standing beside Michael and pleading with police as well to let them know that this was totally just a setup. And amazingly, these police officers who were aware of the previous raids on Michael and Dahlia's property, they told them, look, we do think this is pretty suspicious that somebody keeps calling in about you selling drugs and now magically the drugs are in your car. And so what we're going to do is we're going to confiscate this cocaine. We're not going to arrest you. Instead, go home, be safe, call us if you see anything strange, you hear anything strange, and we're going to begin investigating to figure out who is making all of these calls. And so Michael and Dahlia were totally relieved to hear this, but at the same time, they were kind of terrified because clearly whoever was looking to get Michael in trouble now was prepared to break into his property in order to do it. And so what was stopping them from breaking into their condo and planting drugs in there as well? And so after these police officers left, Michael and Dahlia hopped in the car, they sped back to their condo, they went inside, they searched it top to bottom, looking for any sign that anyone had recently been in there or if there were drugs or anything illegal inside of their condo. And after looking and finding nothing, they just locked their doors, shut their windows, shut the blinds, and just prayed that the police would be able to quickly identify who was doing this to them and make them stop. But over the next few months, the police would not figure out who this anonymous caller was because the caller stopped calling. And so for a little while, Michael and Dahlia were convinced that the whole ordeal was over and done with, and they basically returned to their normal lives. But on August 5th, 2009, roughly 4 months after the cocaine was found in Michael's car, the anonymous caller would come back with a vengeance. On that morning at around 5:45 a.m., Dahlia left the condo, leaving Michael in bed, and she headed out to the local gym to get a workout in. Around 6:30 in the morning, she stepped off the treadmill and she looked at her phone and she saw she had a missed call from a number she didn't recognize, and this number had left her a voicemail. And so she calls her voicemail, she puts it to her ear, and as she's listening, her heart starts to race because it was a Boynton Beach detective telling her there had been some sort of incident at her condo and she needed to come back right away. Terrified, Dahlia grabbed her things and she ran out of the gym, she got in her car, and she called this number back. And when the detective picked up, she tried to get more information from him about what this incident was, what happened. And the detective would only say that it involved her husband, and he would explain everything when she came back. And so in a total state of shock, Dahlia turned on her car, and she sped out of the parking lot, and she headed back towards her condo. And when she turned onto her street and saw her condo, she hit the brakes and just stared. In front of her condo were all these police cars with their lights on, and police officers were walking around, and yellow crime scene tape was lining the outside of her property, and inside of the taped off area there were all these crime scene photographers taking pictures of her condo. And so as Dahlia is sitting in her car at the top of the street just staring at this crazy scene she's seeing, one of the Boynton Beach police officers sees her and walks up, and after confirming that she was Dahlia DiPolito, he said to her, leave your car here and come with me. And so Dahlia, who knows obviously something bad has happened but really doesn't know the extent of it, she puts her car in park, she gets out, and she begins walking with this police officer over towards this cluster of 3 people that are standing right in front of her property. And it would turn out one of them was the detective who had called her on the phone. And so Dahlia is led over, and that detective, as soon as he sees Dahlia, he walks over to her, and he says to her very matter-of-factly that someone had called about a disturbance in their condo, and shots were fired, and unfortunately, her husband, Michael, was dead. Dahlia, who was totally hysterical, was gently led away from her condo into a nearby police car, and they would drive her to the police station where they would sit her down and begin asking her questions about her husband. And they would say to her, look, I know you just found this out, but we've got to figure out what could have happened because a killer is on the loose. We need to find this person and stop them. And so at first, the conversation was really just Dahlia crying and the detective kind of calming her down. But eventually, she would tell the detective about the anonymous caller who kept calling the police and claiming Michael was selling drugs, and how she and Michael suspected that, probably the anonymous caller was connected to someone from his past, maybe someone from the mafia, or maybe one of the victims of his boiler room scam, or it could be any number of other people that Michael had done wrong in the past. And so the detective, he's taking diligent notes, he's listening to Dahlia, and then at some point in a break in the conversation, he says to Dahlia, okay, it's time to get serious. I need to know if you know this guy. And so Dahlia, she was kind of looking down, and she looks up, confused what he's talking about, and then the door opens, and this huge guy in handcuffs walks into the room.
Come here. Bring this guy up. Get over here. Get over here. You know who this guy is? You've never seen him before. Do you know her? No. Get up. What were you doing coming out of her house?
It would turn out Dahlia was lying. She did know who that guy was. Almost immediately after marrying Michael 6 months earlier, she had stolen $200,000 from him, but apparently that wasn't enough for her. She needed the rest of Michael's money as well as his condo. And so she had been the anonymous caller. She was the one calling the police and tipping them off that Michael was selling drugs out of the condo and out of his car. She was the one who planted the cocaine in the back of his car because she wanted him to get arrested because he was on probation and he would go back to jail for a really long time. But when her efforts failed and Michael did not get arrested and so did not go back to jail, Dahlia moved on to Plan B. She reached out to one of her ex-boyfriends and she asked him, hey, do you know any hitmen that could murder my husband? And the ex-boyfriend at first didn't think she was serious, but when she kept asking him about it and began offering to pay and really was making it clear that she wasn't joking around, the ex-boyfriend basically told her, no, I don't know any hitmen. And then he, the ex-boyfriend, called the Boynton Beach Police Department and told them about Dahlia and her plan to hire a hitman to kill Michael. And so when the Boynton Beach Police Department found out about this plot, they immediately had one of their undercover agents pose as a hitman set up a meeting with Dahlia. And so the undercover agent was that huge guy in handcuffs that was led into the room with Dahlia. And so Dahlia goes to meet the undercover agent, the fake hitman. She gets into his car, and there's a hidden camera in the back seat that's filming her the whole time. And she's caught on camera saying she wants to kill her husband. She gives money to the undercover agent. And then as she's about to get out, the agent turns to her and he says, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because as soon as you leave, it's done. I'm going to kill Michael, and you can't stop it." This is Dahlia's reaction.
There's no changing, no, there's no, like, I'm determined already, I'm positive, like, 5,000% sure, like, no, when I said to do something, I'm gonna do it, like, as soon as he told me I was gonna need the money from him, I went, I grabbed it right away, like, we're good to go. Like, with me, you're not gonna have a problem, you're not gonna have an issue.
And so the Boynton Beach Police Department, they have all this information about what Dahlia thinks is going to happen, and they decide they can use this information to set her up in the most elaborate way possible. And it just so happened the very popular true crime TV show, Cops, was filming in the area. And so the Boynton Beach Police Department allowed Cops to be a part of this elaborate setup. So they got to film everything that happened. So on the morning of August 5th, Dahlia got up and left her condo at 5:45 a.m. and headed to the gym, knowing, at least in her mind, that the hitman would be coming to her condo right after her, breaking in and shooting her husband twice in the head, because that was the plan they had come up with that was captured on film. And so after the police see her leave at 5:45 a.m., because they were monitoring the condo, they rushed in, they knocked on the door, and they got Michael to come downstairs. And he had no idea his wife was trying to kill him. So he comes to the door, he's totally confused, but he goes with them, and he's kind of ushered off to the police station. And then for about the next hour, the police set up a very convincing fake crime scene right out front of the condo. And then once it was all set up, that detective called Dahlia and left her a voicemail saying that, there's been this incident, you need to come back to your condo. And then a couple of minutes later, when Dahlia called them back and said, "Okay, I'm coming back to the condo now," that's when the TV crews for the Cops TV show, they kind of set up in the bushes and got ready to film what happened next.
Listen, we had a report of a disturbance at your house, and there were shots fired. Is your husband Michael? Okay, I'm sorry to tell you, man, he's been killed. He's been killed, man. I'm sorry. Listen, try to calm down. Listen, right now, we need to get you to the police station. We need to get you to the police station. We can't let you in, man. We have to do our job.
After the fake hitman was pulled out of the interrogation room, after Dahlia had said, "Oh, I don't know who he is," the detective just stared at her in total silence for a minute. And then he broke the news that he totally knew all about her murder plot and that she was going to jail.
You're going to jail today for solicitation of murder and murder arrest. That's an undercover police officer. Everything has been recorded. You were photographed in the convertible when you sat in his car in the front of CVS. What do you want to do? What do you want to do here, Dahlia? Listen to me.
I didn't do anything.
You're going to
I
jail.
didn't do anything, please, I didn't do anything.
Tell me you didn't do anything.
I didn't do anything.
You're going to jail today. As soon as I'm done, they're gonna come in here and handcuff you and take you to the Palm Beach County Jail, book you for solicitation of first-degree murder on your husband. Your husband is well and alive. Oh, yeah, thank God. No, he doesn't wanna see you. He doesn't wanna see you.
After Dahlia was arrested, she was still sitting in that interrogation room when the Boynton Beach Police Department made a special point of walking Dahlia's husband, Michael, past the open door so she could see him. Here's her reaction.
Oh my God.
What?
Come here, please. Come here. Mike, come here. Come here, please. Come here. Why not? I didn't do anything to you. Mike, come here, please. Come here.
Dahlia was initially sentenced to 20 years in prison for what she had done, but after a retrial because of jury bias, her sentence was reduced to 16 years. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button if you can borrow their car for the week, and then spend that week driving around, picking up as much roadkill as you possibly can, and packing it into their trunk and into their back seat, and then return to the car. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast called Mr. Ballin Podcast, and we put out brand new, never before heard podcast exclusive episodes on Monday mornings. And then on Thursday mornings, we put out remastered audio from popular YouTube videos. Again, it's called Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google. Basically, anywhere you get your podcasts, you can find it there. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called Mr. Ballin Shorts, where we upload random short videos and lost episodes. And the other channel is called Mr. Ballin en Espanol, and it's a Spanish language channel. We also have a Facebook page just called Mr. Ballin that puts out near daily content. We also have a Snapchat channel called Mr. Ballin that puts out content on Sundays. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's story sounds exactly like an urban legend. It sounds too exaggerated, too grotesque, too terrifying to be real. But it is. This is the true story of the Bitsev Park Mania. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to help build the Like Button's new dresser they just got from IKEA. And as soon as you open it up, immediately find all the screws, strip them all, and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. Moscow, Russia, which is one of the world's richest cities, is home to more billionaires than any other European city. But if you travel just 10 miles south of Moscow's richest neighborhood, the Golden Mile, you will reach one of Russia's poorest neighborhoods, the southern Moscow suburbs. Nicknamed Zhytomyr, which means the soul of the world, these suburbs used to be a thriving neighborhood with tens of thousands of working-class Russians and their families calling it their home. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the money and the jobs in this area dried up completely, and even though the residents wanted to relocate and live somewhere with more opportunity, they couldn't. They didn't have the resources to leave, and so they were trapped. And since 1991, really nothing has changed in these suburbs. Today, there are still tens of thousands of now very poor Russian families that still live there, living in these totally overcrowded Soviet apartment buildings that are these big, square, identical-looking things that are literally falling apart. And most of the people who live in these suburbs either are unemployed or they work some dead-end job that barely pays them any money. The police in the suburbs are completely underfunded and, for the most part, are corrupt. And so crime over the years has really taken a dramatic uptick. Also, drug and alcohol abuse are completely running rampant in this part of the world. But despite their notoriously rough living situation in the southern Moscow suburbs, these residents do have one claim to fame, and that is the Bitsevsky Park. Bitsevsky Park is comprised primarily of a massive, lush green forest that is full of wildlife and beautiful streams and clearings, and it sits right on the southern edge of the southern Moscow suburbs. In total, the park covers a whopping 2,700 acres and stretches 4 miles from top to bottom, which makes it 3 times bigger than New York City's famous Central Park. Bitsevsky Park had always been a popular tourist destination for people living around Moscow, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, the park's popularity skyrocketed, specifically amongst people that lived in the southern Moscow suburbs. As their lives continued to become more bleak in the 1990s, they compensated by going to the park as much as they possibly could. They would take long walks in the woods, they would play chess with their friends along the peripheries on the park benches and tables, or they'd go cross-country skiing in the winter. Basically, year-round, this park became their escape from their miserable everyday lives. But that would not last. Starting in the early 2000s, something totally unexplainable and terrifying began happening in the park, specifically in the heavily forested area in the park. And eventually, this unusual event that was taking place got so completely out of hand that the residents of the southern Moscow suburbs stopped going in the park. They were literally too scared to go inside. The strange phenomenon began in 2001. From May to July that year, 10 people went missing after having been spotted either in or right around the outside of the heavily forested area inside of Pitsevsky Park. All of them were alone when they were last spotted, and all of them were men. Now, there was some precedent for people suddenly going missing in this part of Russia. Every now and again, people would try to flee these suburbs to try to make a better life for themselves somewhere else, but time and time again, they would just come back a couple of days or weeks later because it hadn't worked out. But when these 10 men did not come back in a couple of days or weeks, their families went to police and reported them missing. But unsurprisingly, the police did not launch an investigation. Instead, they accused the 10 missing men of just being drunk bums who probably wandered off somewhere, and whatever trouble they were in, it was their fault. Now, the families and the locals did not buy this explanation, but there really wasn't a better explanation. These men really had just kind of vanished. No one had any idea where they went. And so given the kind of general grim outlook on life that lots of people held in this area, people just kind of accepted that whatever happened to these 10 men happened, and there's nothing any of us can do about it. And they moved on. But in October of that year, so 2 months after the 10th man had gone missing in the park, another man went missing in the park. And then by the end of the year, 4 more men had vanished inside of the park. And all of them vanished under the same circumstances. Last spotted alone in or around the heavily forested area in the park. The families of these 5 men would go to police. They would report their family members missing. But again, the police did not launch any investigation and blamed the missing people for being responsible for whatever happened to them. And then after that, the families kind of mourned the loss of these 5 men, not really sure what to make of it. And locals kind of gossiped about it for a little while and started to speculate about what might have happened to them and kind of lumped them in with the 10 other men that had gone missing. But after a while, when no new news came out about what happened to them, they just kind of moved on again. And unbelievably, this pattern would repeat itself for nearly 4 years. From 2002 to late 2005, 25 more people would go missing inside of Pitsevsky Park. 24 of them would be men. 1 of them would be a woman, although it wasn't clear if she was actually in the same category as the other 24 men, but regardless, that put the total number of mysterious disappearances inside of this forested area in the park up to 40. But still, the police shrugged it off, and eventually, so too did the local population. Everyone just kind of moved on, like this phenomenon wasn't happening, that people were not going missing in droves inside of this forest. But everything would change with missing person number 41. Because unlike the previous 40, this missing person would be found again. 63-year-old Nikolai Zakharchenko was a retired police officer who lived in a tiny apartment in the southern Moscow suburbs with his family. He was a classic Russian tough guy who chain-smoked cigarettes and drank lots of vodka. And even though he was well aware of the missing person phenomenon inside of this park, that wasn't about to stop him from doing the thing he loved, which was going on walks inside of this park. He figured whatever was out there, he could handle it. So one evening in November of 2005, Nikolai told his sister that he was going to go out for a walk in the park. But that night, he didn't come back. And so his family was very worried about him, but they decided they would wait until the next morning to see if maybe he showed up. But the following morning, when Nikolai did not show up, his family went to the police. But per usual, the police did nothing. A few days later, a local was walking fairly deep inside of the forest, inside of Bitsevsky Park, when they noticed, well off the trail, off the left side, there was something unusual kind of tucked in the underbrush. Now, this local was all alone, they had kind of a bad feeling about whatever this was, and so they called the police, and they reported seeing something strange. And surprisingly, the police did actually come out, and they went over to investigate, and they found this unusual thing was Nikolai Zakharchenko. He was lying face down, he was fully clothed, and he only had one injury, but it obviously had been fatal. He had a massive hole on the back of his head. This was not from a gunshot. This was from massive blunt force trauma. He had been struck so hard that literally the back half of his skull was blown clear off. The police searched the area in hopes they might find the murder weapon or some other clue as to what happened to him, but there was nothing. And so all the police could deduce was that Nikolai had obviously been attacked either by a person or group of people or even an animal, and that whoever his attacker was or whatever his attacker was had clearly snuck up on him, given the location of his injury. Now that the police had a body, and it likely looked like it was a murder, they could no longer ignore the fact that so many people had gone missing inside of this park, and it was looking like probably if they looked around the park, they might find more bodies. So the local police called in reinforcements from Russia's Criminal Investigation Department, and they came to the southern Moscow suburbs, and with the local police, they began searching every inch of this park, looking for more bodies, or just for any indication of who or what was behind this attack and behind all these missing people. But after several days of a very extensive search, where they looked everywhere in this park, all over the forested area, they found nothing. At the same time this huge police search was going down inside of Bitsevsky Park, news about Nikolai's death had spread amongst the southern Moscow suburbs, and people were now getting really scared. Before, the fear of the park felt kind of theoretical because there were no bodies. And so even though it seemed far-fetched, it did seem possible that maybe all these people were getting lost on their own, that they really were just drunks stumbling off. But now, with the discovery that one of these missing people had been horrifically killed, that made the danger associated with this park feel very real. And so it was around this time that most residents of these suburbs stopped going inside of this park in fear of whatever was out there in the forest. And they would forbid their children from going in, and they would tell their neighbors, don't go in the park. And they gave this evil thing that lurked in the forest that caused men to disappear and attack Nikolai, they gave this thing a name. They called it the Bitsevsky Park Maniac. But despite the fear of this maniac causing so many people to avoid this park, and despite the massive police presence that was in the park, constantly looking for bodies, looking for clues, and just generally patrolling the area, despite all that, people still continued to go missing in this park. Starting just a week after the discovery of Nikolai's body in November of 2005, all the way up to April of 2006, 9 more men would mysteriously vanish in the forested section of Bitsevsky Park. And just like Nikolai, just a couple of days after they were reported missing by their families, they would be found lying out in the middle of the park with the backs of their heads caved in. But unlike Nikolai, most of these 9 victims had been found with a glass bottle jammed into the hole in the back of their head, meaning almost certainly this was the work of a human, not some animal. By this point, almost no one was stepping foot inside of the park, because it was basically common knowledge that, a serial killer is obviously on the loose in the forest. But despite this, there were still some very stubborn people who continued to go inside of the park. And one of those people was 32-year-old Alexander Pichushkin. He had been born in the southern Moscow suburbs, and he still lived with his family in the same tiny apartment he had grown up in. It's safe to say Alexander's life had been more difficult than his peers. When he was just 4 years old, he fell backwards off of his swing, and when he sat up, he was okay, but the swing came swinging back and smashed him in the front of the head, causing brain damage. Now, his family did not have the money to send him to a hospital, and so when he stood up after getting struck and he was kind of able to walk around and he seemed okay, they determined he was fine and they didn't follow up. But Alexander was not fine. The injury had impaired his cognitive abilities, and years later, when he went to school, the other kids would bully him for sounding dumb. By the time Alexander was in high school, he felt like an outcast. He didn't have any friends, and he was miserable. But his grandfather, who lived in the same apartment complex as he did, he noticed this about Alexander, and he decided he would take him under his wing and he would look after him. And so the first thing he did is he asked Alexander to come over, and he taught him how to play chess, believing that would be something they could bond over. And when he taught Alexander the rules of this game, which are quite complicated, it was like it opened up the secret portion of Alexander's brain that had never been opened before. Alexander immediately absorbed all this information about chess and became a master of it practically overnight. Within a couple of days of being taught how to play, he was beating his grandfather virtually every time they played together. And so his grandfather was totally thrilled about this and was very proud of Alexander. And so he decided to bring Alexander down to Bitsevsky Park, where all these old men who were total chess masters were always playing chess on all of the park benches and tables. And so he brought Alexander down there, and he put him up against all of these incredible players, and very quickly, Alexander was wiping the floor with them. And they loved him for it. He was their star. He was their prodigy. They totally adored him, and they respected him. When they found out he was getting bullied at school, they made a point of telling him that he would always have a place with them in this park. And so for Alexander, this was like the best moment of his life. He finally felt like he was accepted, and he finally felt happy. And so over the years, even after Alexander's grandfather passed away, Alexander continued to go down to Bitsevsky Park to play chess virtually every day. And he kept going to the park to play chess, even when men began going missing in the park, including some of the men he played chess with. And Alexander continued going to the park to play chess, even after bodies began piling up in the park. Alexander's mother was terrified for him and felt like he didn't understand the risk he was putting himself in by going to this park all the time, but every time she pleaded with him not to go, just take one day off from playing chess, Alexander would say, "Mom, I'm gonna be fine." He would leave anyways. In April of 2006, Alexander was 32 years old and worked for a local grocery store stocking shelves. By this point, at least 50 people had vanished mysteriously in the forested section of the park, and 10 bodies had been found. On the morning of the 12th of that month, Alexander showed up to the grocery store for his shift, and right away he noticed there was a new employee. It was this beautiful older woman he had never seen before, and Alexander, while he was confident playing chess, was not remotely confident around women. He had never had a girlfriend before. But he found himself looking at this woman across the store, feeling like she was different, that she was more approachable than other women. And so he told himself that day he was going to go up to her and he was going to say hi. And so all through his shift, he kind of awkwardly watched this woman from a distance, kind of building up his confidence. And then at the end of his shift, her shift was also ending, the pair walked outside at the same time, and Alexander was about to say something, but he just couldn't find his voice. And then he noticed this woman had put a cigarette in her mouth, but she was fishing around for her lighter, like she couldn't find it. And so Alexander jumped into action and pulled his own lighter out, and he held it out to her and said, "Hey, can I light your cigarette?" And so before long, the two were chatting, and they were walking together and smoking their cigarettes. And over the course of their conversation, Alexander would learn this woman was named Larissa Koligina, and she was 48 years old, and she lived near Alexander's apartment. And so after they walked for a little while, they arrived in front of her apartment building, and at this point, Alexander knows she's about to go inside, and so he suddenly feels bold, and he asks Larissa, "Hey, do you want to continue walking around with me for a bit and maybe do a pass through the park?" Now, at this point, the Bitsevsky Park was totally not a place you would bring people to. This is a place that everyone in the area is basically terrified of. But for Alexander, Bitsevsky Park was like his happy place. And so naturally, if he's going to take a woman on a date, that's where he's going to bring her. And surprisingly, Larissa was very quick to say, "Oh, let's go to the park." And so the two, they lit up another cigarette and they walked across the road and they walked through the front gates of the park. Their first stop was the chess tables along the periphery of the park, right outside of the forest, and the tables were totally empty. But at this point, that wasn't surprising given the fact that even amongst diehard chess players, really Alexander was the only one still willing to go back in there every single day. And so after seeing where Alexander spent all of his time, it seemed like it was time to turn around and leave. But neither Alexander nor Larissa wanted their date to end, and so they decided to light up another cigarette and then follow a walking path that kind of looped into the forest and came back out again. And as they entered the woods and got deeper and deeper into the forest, the chess tables that were behind them faded from view, and the sky began to get darker and darker as it was getting late. But the pair just kept on walking, maintaining their cheerful conversation. But at some point, as they talked and walked, the path below their feet stopped looking like the path they had originally set out on. Now they're stepping over broken logs, and they're ducking under low-hanging branches, and it's not really clear if they're on a marked trail anymore. But neither of them bring it up. They just maintain their kind of light conversation and continue walking as if nothing's going on. However, they both definitely began walking faster and faster to maybe speed up this loop. But at some point, when it was very obvious they were no longer on a path, they both came to a stop. As they had walked, Alexander had been in front, and so when they came to a stop, he turned around and he looked at Larissa, and right away he could tell there was just something wrong about her. There was a look on her face that just didn't look right. She looked exhausted or sad or something. And then as he's looking at her, she inexplicably kind of collapses into a tree right next to her, and she grabs the tree with her arms, she slides down to its base, and she presses her cheek and her chest up against its bark, and she begins to cry. Alexander has no idea what's going on, so he just stands there staring at her. And in between sobs, Larissa looks up at Alexander and says, "You're the maniac, aren't you?" Alexander couldn't believe it. She was the first person to figure it out so quickly. Normally, he would have to tell his victims before he killed them. And so he smirked and he looked at her and he said, "Yes, I am." And so Larissa, at this point, she lets out this huge sob and she looks down and she keeps crying, and then she looks back up again at him and she says, "Are you going to kill me?" And without any hesitation, Alexander looks at her and he says, "Yes, I am." And then he reached into his jacket and he pulled out a hammer. No one knows for sure why Alexander became a serial killer or why he almost exclusively targeted men. Many people believe it might have something to do with the brain damage he suffered as a 4-year-old when that swing hit him in the head, that somehow that rewired his brain and made him more aggressive towards other people, especially men. But that's just speculation. And other than that injury, there really isn't much in Alexander's life that stands out as a big red flag. He just kind of floated about his life and followed the crowd. But in 1992, when he was 18 years old, he got this urge to kill, and he actually decided to act on it. He brought up this desire to a classmate of his named Mikhail Odachuk, and surprisingly, Mikhail says to Alexander, "I want to kill someone too. Let's do it together." And so the two met up a couple of days later, and they headed off to Bitsevsky Park and began walking around the forest looking for a lone person that could be their victim. As they're walking along, Alexander, he's fully committed, but he can tell Mikhail is not. He's starting to get cold feet, and he's talking about, maybe let's stop for now and head back and maybe do this another time. And Alexander, he's getting more and more angry and frustrated with Mikhail, until finally Alexander decides, my first victim will be Mikhail. And so he turns to Mikhail and he says, "You know what? If you want to head back, you can." Mikhail says, "Okay, maybe we can do this another time, right?" And Alexander says, "Sure." And so Mikhail turns around, and as soon as his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer and he smashes Mikhail in the back of the skull, causing Mikhail to crumple to the ground, either dead or unconscious. But either way, he's laying on the ground. And as soon as he is, Alexander remembers that they had passed a little while earlier this well kind of hidden in the middle of the forest. And so he grabbed Mikhail's body and he dragged him through the forest over to this well. And when he got to the well, he pulled the lid off of it and picked Mikhail's body up, pushed him up and over the edge, and dropped him inside. And Mikhail fell 30 feet all the way down to the icy water below. And then Alexander put the lid back on the well, he his hammer off the ground, and he left. An important part of Alexander's killing was this well. This well was not a drinking water well. It was basically an access point to this deep underground sewer system that stretched all around the underside of this park. And so when Mikhail fell down this 30-foot shaft, he didn't just land at a pit of water right at the bottom of the well. Instead, he fell all the way down the shaft until it opened up like the bottom of a huge scientific beaker. It was basically like this big cave at the bottom of the well that was full of very deep water. And so Mikhail would have splashed into that water, which was icy cold, and then after Alexander put the lid on top of the well, it would have been pitch black inside of that space. Now, even if it had been lit up, there was no ladder for Mikhail to climb back out of. And there was a current running through this well because there were tunnels leading into it and then out the other side. And so Mikhail, if he woke up, if he was conscious when he hit the water, he would have immediately been swept into another tunnel. And many of the other tunnels that led away from this cave space were completely filled with water. And so he would have had nowhere to breathe. He would have been sucked into a tunnel and he would have drowned. And so whether Mikhail died from the strike on the back of the head or whether he drowned, we don't know. But he died after being thrown in the well, and then his body was swept miles and miles away to some deep underwater recess where nobody was looking. Alexander would wait another 9 years before he killed again. But once he started up again, he didn't stop. His first kill after the hiatus was in the summer of 2001. His victim was a man he liked to play chess with. In fact, this was a man that loved Alexander and was definitely one of Alexander's friends. They regularly played chess with each other. And one day in May, after a game of chess, Alexander asked the man if he wanted to head into the forest to pay respects to his dog, who he had buried out in this forest. And he told the man he was going to have a sip of vodka over his dog's grave. And so this chess friend of his agrees to go with Alexander because he loves Alexander, he's a good friend of his, and says, absolutely, let's go pay our respects to your dog. And so the pair begin walking into the forest, and at first they're on a trail, but eventually Alexander says to this man that you need to leave the trail in order to get to the gravesite. So the man says, yeah, no problem. And so they get off the trail and they're walking for a little while until they reach the well. And when they get to the well, Alexander stops and he kind of points to some arbitrary spot on the ground and says, oh, that's where my dog was buried. And so Alexander pulls out a bottle of vodka and he takes a swig and then he hands it to the man who does the same thing to kind of do this commemorative drink for this dog. And then afterwards, Alexander looks at his friend and kind of gestures with his arm to get the man to, take them back out of the forest, back out to the chess tables. And so the man turns around and begins backtracking. And as soon as he does, and his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer, he walks up behind his friend, and he smashes him over the back of the head. And then just like Mikhail, he drags this man's body over to the edge of the well, he pulls the lid of the well off, and then he lifts this man up, and he dumps him into the well shaft, and then he puts the lid back on top. Alexander continued to lure his victims out to that well, and all of his victims were people he knew. They were his chess friends. They were his neighbors in his apartment complex. They were anyone he had a personal relationship with. He would later say that that was his preferred victim. He liked to know the person he was killing. It made him feel like God. Amazingly, it would turn out not all of Alexander's victims who were chucked into that well actually died. Victims number 16 and 17, who were a pregnant woman and a 13-year-old boy respectively, after they had their heads smashed with a hammer and they got chucked into the well, their clothing got caught on a snag poking out of the inside of that 30-foot shaft. And it literally arrested their fall and kept them from plummeting all the way into the water. And somehow, in both instances, Alexander didn't notice. He just put the well lid back on and walked away, believing they were both dead. But they weren't, and after they regained consciousness, they were able to kind of claw their way back up the well shaft and pull themselves out of the well. Both victims would go to the police, and both of them would positively identify who their attacker was, Alexander. But the police didn't care. In fact, they told both of these victims that they needed to drop the charges and leave them alone. And if they didn't, they, the police, would come up with something to have both of them arrested, the victims. And so Alexander got away with it, and the victims were literally intimidated by the police to stay quiet. And so that led to dozens and dozens more murders. In April of 2006, after Alexander told Larissa he was the maniac and he was going to kill her, he walked behind her as she cried and continued to hold onto the tree, and he wound up his hammer and brought it smashing into the back of her head. And then as she slumped to the ground, he hit her several more times in the back of the head with the hammer, and then he pulled out a vodka bottle and he jammed it inside of the hole, and then he left. 2 months later, Alexander would lure another woman out into the middle of the forest with him. Her name was Marina. She was 35 years old, and she had met Alexander while working at the grocery store with him. She actually was hired to work at the grocery store to fill Larissa's now vacant spot. Before Alexander and Marina began their walk out to the park, which was Alexander's suggestion, Marina said she just needed to stop by her apartment to let her son know where she was going. And so they swung by her apartment. Marina went upstairs and she left a note for her teenage son saying where she was going and who she would be with, and she even left behind Alexander's name and his phone number on this note. And so when she came back out again and she and Alexander began walking towards the park, Alexander knew that if he killed her, which was his intention, that he would certainly be caught. The police were on super high alert at this point, and they would certainly get their hands on this note, and that would absolutely implicate him. And so he didn't really know what to do. But by the time they were strolling into the forest, Alexander had decided he was going to kill her anyways. And many people believe he did this specifically to get caught, not to protect the public from himself, but because he wanted fame. He wanted recognition for what he had done. This theory stems from the fact that starting with his 41st victim, Nikolai Zakharchenko, Alexander began leaving his victims' bodies out in the open. He stopped putting them into that well. And he wouldn't just leave them out in the open. He would prop them up in strange poses against trees, and he would jam glass bottles into the holes in the backs of their heads, indicating he wanted the police to find them. That way, he could get all the credit he believed he deserved. When the police did finally arrest Alexander, they searched his apartment and they found this notebook. And in this notebook was a picture of a chessboard. Now, a chessboard has 64 squares on it, and in Alexander's notebook, this chessboard had 62 of the 64 squares filled in. And Alexander would explain to police that that was his scorecard. He had 62 victims. It would turn out 2 of those people had actually survived, the pregnant woman and the 13-year-old boy, but still, there were 60 murders accounted for in this notebook. Alexander would be fully cooperative with police and would tell them every detail he could possibly remember about every single killing, including what conversations were like with the person he killed right before he killed them. He would also often reenact what he did to the person and how he felt afterwards. It was very clear that Alexander was reveling in the attention he was getting from law enforcement, and it was very clear that he loved talking about killing. Ultimately, the police were only able to gather enough evidence to charge Alexander with 49 murders, not 60. And when Alexander heard this, he was totally disappointed, and he asked the judge if he could get credit for the other 11 murders to maintain his 60 victim mark. The judge said no. During his trial, Alexander was deemed to be such a threat, he was kept inside of a glass cage the entire time. And during the proceedings, he showed no remorse, and in fact, seemed kind of happy, like he was enjoying the spectacle of his trial. He was ultimately given the harshest penalty under Russian law at the time, which was life in prison without parole, and the first 15 years of his life sentence would be in complete and total solitary confinement. So virtually no human interaction, kept inside of his cell 24 hours a day with nothing in his cell all day long. Alexander is still alive today, and he is still in solitary confinement. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to help build the Like Button's new dresser they got from IKEA. And as soon as you open it up, take all the screws out, strip them all, and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast where we upload brand new, never before heard content on Monday mornings We also upload remastered YouTube content on Thursdays. The podcast is just called Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, Amazon. Basically, anywhere you get your podcasts, you can find it there. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on any major social media platform. My username for all of them is just @MrBallin, and I do respond to the majority of my DMs. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, Mr. Ballin Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes, and Mr. Ballin en Español, which is a Spanish language channel. We also have a Facebook page just called Mr. Ballin that puts out near daily content, and we also have a Snapchat channel, also just called Mr. Ballin, that posts on Sundays. We also have some very cool merch. If you want to check that out, go over to shopmrballin.com. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, podcasts, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See you. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please gently pull up behind the like button at a red light, and the instant it turns green, immediately lay on your horn to speed the like button up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 7:20 p.m. on Friday, January 12, 2007, 19-year-old college freshman Wade Steffi walked into Ford Dining Hall, which is one of 5 dining halls on Purdue University's campus. Purdue is a prestigious American university located in Indiana that is known for its excellent athletics and academics. Wade, who was an aviation technology student and was at Purdue on a full academic scholarship, grabbed some food and then sat down at a table with some friends. This was the first Friday of the 2007 spring semester, and so Wade and his friends at the table and the hundreds of other students that were sitting all around them were buzzing with excitement about what they were up to that night and what they were up to that weekend. And so Wade and his friends, they sat there chatting about their plans for about an hour, and then at around 8:20 p.m., Wade realized he needed to leave, and so he stood up, he said goodbye to his friends, he carried his tray to the trash can, and then he made his way out of the doors he came in on. And so once he was outside of the dining hall, he immediately turned right and walked the very short distance to the building that was right next to Ford Dining Hall. And so that building was called Owen Hall, and it was a dormitory. Now, this was not Wade's dormitory. He actually lived in a different dorm called Cary Quad West, which was located on the other side of Ford Dining Hall. And so Wade goes inside of Owen Hall because he has some friends in there, and he makes his way to their room, and when he goes inside, he sees they're all kind of sitting around chatting and drinking some alcoholic drinks. And so Wade sits down and he has a couple of drinks and he just hangs out with his friends for about an hour. And so around 9:30 p.m., Wade and the other people he was with in this room, they left Owen Hall and they walked the half mile away from campus to the west to this huge party at a fraternity. And so Wade would stay at this fraternity for several hours until about midnight, at which point he pulled one of his friends aside and he told them that he just remembered he had left his jacket inside of Owen Hall, and so he wanted to go back and retrieve it. The dorms on Purdue's campus all lock at night, and so the only way you can get inside is if you live there and so you have a key, or if you know someone who lives there who will open the door for you. And so during his walk back to Owen Hall, Wade would make 6 phone calls in an attempt to get someone in Owen Hall to open the door for him. But 4 of his phone calls would just be the wrong number. And so the people that were picking up and he was asking to open the door, they didn't know what he was talking about, and so they hung up. But he did call 2 people that did live inside of Owen Hall. However, they didn't answer their phones. And so around 12:30 a.m., Wade arrived at Owen Hall. He put his phone back in his pocket, and he just walked up to the doors, which were locked, and he just started knocking. And eventually, a resident of Owen Hall, who didn't know Wade, and Wade didn't know them, they heard the knocking, and they came out to the door to see what was going on, and they looked through the glass, and they saw Wade, and apparently, they decided that Wade looked too intoxicated to let into the building, and so they refused him entry. And so Wade apparently stood there, he kept knocking for a little bit, but he eventually just kind of gave up, he turned around, and he walked away. Fast forward a few days to Tuesday, January 16th, and Wade's roommate, who had actually been gone all the past weekend, he returned, and the first thing he noticed when he got back to his dorm was that Wade was not in the dorm. And so he called and texted Wade, but he didn't get a response. And so the roommate went out around the floor that they lived on to ask people if they had seen Wade, and no one had seen him since the previous Friday. And so starting to get pretty concerned, the roommate called Wade's family to see if maybe they knew what was going on with him, but his family had no idea. And so by the end of that day, the police had been contacted about Wade potentially being missing, and they in turn contacted Wade's cell phone provider, and they were able to determine that Wade's cell phone was still showing up somewhere on Purdue's campus, although they couldn't figure out exactly where. So that evening, a massive campus-wide search was launched with hundreds of police officers and volunteers. Even the school's equestrian club came out with their horses to search the nearby woods. But despite this huge search effort that would go on for several weeks, the only thing they would find of Wade's was one of his shoes. It was found on January 20th, so just 4 days into the search, and it was located right outside of an exterior door that led into a maintenance room inside of Owen Hall. But when they searched this maintenance room, Wade wasn't in there. Finally, after nearly a month of searching, when they still had not found Wade, the official search was called off. On March 19th, roughly 2 months after Wade had been reported missing, a maintenance worker was downstairs in the laundry room of Owen Hall when they heard a strange popping sound. At first, the worker thought it was actually coming from one of the washers or dryers that was on, and maybe there's a loose coin or some piece of metal that was inside of the washer or dryer that's getting banged around inside, and that's making the sound. And so this worker began walking around the laundry room, kind of listening in to each of the washers and dryers that were on to see if they were making this sound. And so as he's doing this, he hears the popping sound again, but it's clearly not coming from any of the washers and dryers. In fact, it's not even coming from inside the laundry room. It's coming from somewhere out in the hall. Curious, he leaves the laundry room and he goes out into the hall, and as soon as he's standing in the hall, he hears the popping sound again. And this time, it was obvious that it was coming from behind the closed door that was directly opposite the laundry room. So the worker pulled out his big set of keys, he opened the door that was directly in front of him, and he stepped inside. Moments later, he would make a big discovery. Based on that discovery and the investigation that would follow it, this is a reconstruction of what happened to Wade Steffi. In the early morning hours of January 13th, right after Wade had been denied entry into Owen Hall because the student who was in there who didn't know him thought he was too intoxicated, right after that happened, Wade left the front doors and made his way around to the left side of the building to look for another way inside. And when he got to the left side of the building, he found another door. Now, even though this door did not have a sign on it that said "keep out," it was fairly obvious that this door was not designed for students to use. There was a metal railing that lined the outside of this door, clearly to prevent pedestrians from getting to the door, and the door itself was actually not built at ground level. It basically was built at basement level. So you'd be standing at this railing looking down at the door, and down in front of the door was a slab of cement right out in front of it that gave the door enough clearance to be able to open. And so basically there was a railing around a pit, and that was where the door was. The proper way to get to this door was to literally climb over that railing and jump down into this pit. And then you'd need a key to open this door because it was always locked. Well, it was supposed to always be locked. And so when Wade saw this clearly off-limits door on the side of Owen Hall, in his drunken state,
he decided it would be a good idea to try to go into it, because in his mind, he thought, whatever is behind the store doesn't really matter. As long as I can just get inside of some part of Owen Hall, I can find my way up to my friend's room and I can get my jacket. And so he rushes over to the railing, he climbs over, he leaps down into that pit area, he grabs the doorknob of this off-limits door and he pulls on it, and it's open. So he opens it up, he steps inside, and it's totally pitch black. And all he can hear is the sound of machines humming and whirring in the darkness. And again, in his drunken state, he decides this is still a good idea. His only concern was he couldn't find a light switch, and it really was basically pitch black in here, and he was worried once the door shut, not only would his only light source be totally cut off, but it might actually lock behind him, and then he'd be trapped inside of this room. And so he took off one of his shoes and he tucked it in the door jamb of the door he came in on to keep it open. And so with the door propped open behind him, he began walking into this room. And pretty much right away, he bumped into this big metal structure. He couldn't see what it was, because again, it was too dark, but he could feel it, and he could tell, it was a flat metal structure. It felt like a machine of some kind, and he could hear that it was one of the machines that was buzzing and whirring. And so he just decided he would try to walk around it, because again, his goal is just to get through this room and find another door somewhere and kind of continue his journey up into the dorm. And so Wade began moving his way left along this machine, kind of believing it was going to come to a stop at some point, and then he could walk around it. But it would turn out this machine was very big, very wide. And so by the time he actually got to the left edge of this machine, he was practically right up against the wall of the room he was in. And when he got there, he realized the space between the side of the machine and the wall of the room was big enough that if he turned sideways, he could basically squeeze his way past it. Now, he had no idea how far into the room this strange machine went, but in his drunken state, he decided it was a good idea. And so he turns sideways, so his back is to the wall of the room, and his chest is going to be facing the machine, and he begins pushing himself into that narrow space. And so as he's making his way, his hands are up, kind of protecting his face and neck, and at some point he kind of begins to trip. Now, he didn't actually fall because he's basically wedged into this tight space. But for a second, he reflexively grabbed with his hands onto this machine right in front of him, and just by chance, his left ring finger slipped into a very narrow hole that was about 2 inches deep. The room that Wade was inside of was called an electrical vault, and it contained 6 large transformers, one of which Wade's finger had just stuck inside of. The job of these 6 transformers is to take the high voltage they receive from the main power grid and then transform it, hence the name, into lower, usable voltage that gets dispersed into Owen Hall for residents and teachers. Even though the outside of these transformers had mostly been covered with protective materials that mitigated the electrocution risk, there were still several parts of these machines that there was just nothing you could do. They just presented a really high electrocution risk. And one of those sections you needed to be extra careful with was that 2-inch hole that Wade's finger slipped inside of. At the back of that hole was an exposed electrical conductor, and the second the tip of his finger touched that conductor, between 2,000 and 4,000 volts of electricity were pumped into his body. For reference, when people get executed via the electric chair, they are electrocuted with 2,000 volts of electricity. Wade likely died instantly. But because of the fact that he was kind of wedged between the transformer and the wall, after he died, he didn't just slump onto the ground. Instead, he remained in a semi-upright position with his fingers still stuck inside of that hole. And so for the next 2 months, his body just continued to be electrocuted every second. Finally, sometime in March, as a result of Wade's body fluids draining out of him, the electrical current that was being pumped into him altered its course and began snapping outside of his skin into the ground. And so the sound of the electrical current actually striking the ground was that popping sound that the maintenance worker heard. The door that the maintenance worker opened in order to investigate the sound was the only other door that led into the electrical vault, the other being the exterior door that Wade had gone in on. Initially, when the worker opened that door and looked inside of the vault, he actually didn't see Wade, but he smelled something funny, and that was what led him to walk into the room and make his way around, and that's when he spotted Wade's body. Earlier, on January 20th, when they found Wade's shoe, which at some point had just slipped out of the door jamb, so it was not propping open the exterior door when it was found, it was just sitting in that pit area, and the exterior door was shut. And so when they found that shoe, the police, they did go inside of the electrical vault, but they didn't go in through the exterior door. They went around and went in the same door that the maintenance worker opened from right across the hall from the laundry room. And when they opened it up, they just looked into the room. They didn't walk into the room, they just looked from the doorway, and from their perspective, they couldn't see Wade. And so that was why initially they had said, Wade is not inside of that room. Ultimately, because that exterior door to the electrical vault was supposed to be locked at all times, and clearly it was not because that's how Wade got in, Purdue was found to be negligent, and so they agreed to pay Wade's family $500,000, and they also set up a scholarship in Wade's name. Before we get into our next story, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. When I first sought out therapy to try to deal with some of my mental health issues, I remember feeling really nervous about that first interaction with the therapist. The idea of sitting in this room and pouring my heart out to this person I barely knew seemed really stressful and almost made me not want to go through with it. Now, I'm glad that I did go through with it because therapy has been an extremely important and positive thing in my life, but I wish there had just been an option to take a phone call with my therapist to kick off the relationship. Well, with BetterHelp, that is an option because BetterHelp is an online therapy platform that offers secure phone call sessions as well as video sessions, and they have a great chat feature that allows you to message your therapist at any time. So far, the people from our strange, dark, and mysterious community who have given BetterHelp a shot have been very pleased with their experience. BetterHelp is very easy to sign up for and use. You just fill out this questionnaire that helps assess your specific needs, and then within 48 hours, you're paired up with a therapist. Then you begin to schedule your sessions with or without video. If at any time you want to change your therapist, it is free and easy to do so. So if you're struggling right now with your mental health, but you've held off starting therapy because maybe you are intimidated about starting the process, then I would highly encourage you to make BetterHelp your starting point. And you get 10% off your first month if you go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin. Again, that's betterhelp.com/MrBallin. Okay, back to the stories. During the California Gold Rush of 1848, hundreds of thousands of Americans living on the east coast of the United States packed up their things in covered wagons and headed west for California to attempt to, quite literally, strike gold. About a year after the rush started, so in the winter of 1849, a group of about 100 would-be gold prospectors were on their way across the continental United States to California when they got lost in this totally barren stretch of desert roughly 500 miles from their destination, which was San Francisco. They would spend the next 2 months driving around this desert looking for a way out, but they wouldn't find it, and so finally they just stopped, set up camp, and waited to die. But as a last-ditch effort, they sent ahead 2 of their fittest men to try to go out and find help. And miraculously, those 2 men would find help, and it wasn't long before the lost pioneers were going up and over this mountain pass out of the desert out to safety. And so as the pioneers are cresting this mountain, one of the pioneers turns and looks down at the desert valley below where they almost all died, and he famously said, "Goodbye, Death Valley," and the name stuck. While Death Valley has since become a very popular tourist destination for adventurous people, it is still truly one of the harshest environments on the planet. In addition to just being a big open desert, which presents a whole host of problems to any mammal, Death Valley also becomes one of the hottest places on the planet every summer. The temperatures soar to 120 degrees Fahrenheit and sometimes get as high as 136 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the kind of place where if you don't respect it, it will kill you. In 2005, a 35-year-old man named Robert Darmer, who lived in Los Angeles, California, decided he wanted to take a trip into Death Valley. Specifically, he wanted to go to the hot springs located in the northwest corner of Death Valley, and actually there's a nudist resort that is right around those hot springs. And so Robert wanted to go check that whole scene out. And so on July 26th of that year, Robert left Los Angeles in his Volkswagen van, and he drove north about 4 hours until he got to Bishop, California, which is a small town where some of his family lived. After spending the night with them, the next morning when Robert got up, he got back into his van and he drove south about 20 minutes to a town called Zurich, California, where he picked up Death Valley Road. This road covers the entirety of Death Valley, starting from its northern entrance, where Robert was, all the way south 140 miles to its southern entrance. And this road is actually basically a straight line. But off of this very straight road are literally hundreds of miles of unpaved roads that splinter off in all directions across the desert. And these roads bring people to other points of interest, like, for example, the nudist resort that Robert wanted to go to. So after Robert hopped onto the Death Valley Road at its northern entrance, he began driving south for about an hour, and then he began looking for the turnoff to the unpaved road that would take him the last 50 miles to the nudist resort. And so eventually, Robert believes he's found this turnoff, and so he gets onto this unpaved road and he starts driving for a while, and then all of a sudden his car just sinks down into the ground and it won't budge. It would turn out Robert had made a mistake. He had not turned onto the correct unpaved road. Instead, he had picked a road that led right out onto this salt flat. And so to the naked eye, it would have looked like the ground in front of him was totally flat and hard packed, and you could easily walk on or drive on it. But in reality, the surface of the salt flat is very brittle, and underneath that brittle surface is this thick section of mud. And so before Robert could realize his mistake, he had broken through the surface layer of the salt flat and got stuck in that mud. After trying unsuccessfully to get his van back out again, Robert realized he was in a really bad situation. His cell phone had no reception, so he couldn't contact anyone, and he was too far away to attempt to walk to the nearest civilization to try to get help. But luckily, he had packed lots and lots of water that was in his van, and so he decided the only thing he could do was just sit tight at his van, ration out his water, and wait for someone on Death Valley Road to look out and see him and come to his rescue. But after waiting for 6 days, no one saw him. And now his water supply was dwindling, and so Robert decided his only option was to abandon his van and make the walk to civilization. And so he packed up all the water he could, he threw it on his back, and he began to walk. And just like the lost pioneers of 1849, at the very last second, Robert was rescued. As he stumbled across the desert, his canteen empty, this group of teenage boys and a few adults who were part of this group called the League of Venturers were out in Death Valley doing search and rescue training. And so they literally turned onto the same road that Robert accidentally turned onto and then got stuck on. And so they came down and found Robert. And Robert, when he saw them, he was hysterical, he was crying tears of joy. He really believed he was going to die probably that day. And so the League of Venturers, they take Robert into their van and they drive him 80 miles to the nearest ranger station. And as soon as Robert got out of the car, he dropped to his knees and he kissed the ground in appreciation. I mean, this guy really was that close to death. That evening, Robert would hitch a ride from the ranger station back to Bishop, California. And the next morning, Robert spoke with a local towing company and they agreed to drive him out into Death Valley to locate his van and tow it back out again. But when they got out there and they found his van, the towing company saw that the van was not in good shape. It had 2 flat tires and there were several other mechanical issues with it. And they told Robert, look, we can't tow it out until the repairs are made, and we can't make those repairs right now. And so they left the van where it was, and they drove Robert back to Bishop. And then when they got there, Robert, who was quite handy with his van, decided he would just make the repairs himself. And so he went around town, he gathered up all the supplies he would need, and then that evening, he got a local young couple to give him a ride back into Death Valley. Robert had told his family right before he left that his plan was to go and fix his van, and then that night come back to Bishop, and then the next day he would contact the towing company again, and they could come out and they could get his van out. But that night, Robert did not come back to Bishop, and the next morning, when his family still had not heard from him or seen him, they contacted authorities. It would take a few days, but the authorities would eventually figure out what happened to Robert. The young couple that gave Robert a ride back into Death Valley, they dropped him off at this intersection right off of Death Valley Road, where they and Robert believed was only about a mile away from that nudist resort that Robert had originally wanted to go to. Robert had told the couple that his plan was just to walk from that point. He would go to that resort and he would recruit somebody else to drive him the rest of the way to the van. He could make the repairs and that person would drive him back and that would be it. So Robert got out, he said thank you to the couple and he waved to them as they drove off, and then he stashed his van supplies and then turned away from Death Valley Road and began walking along this unpaved road into the desert. However, unbeknownst to Robert or to the couple, the spot he was dropped off was the wrong spot. He was not a mile or less away from this resort. He was about 15 miles away from this resort, and the path was fairly circuitous, so even if he knew the distance, he likely would not have been able to even navigate his way there. And so after wandering down this unpaved road for about 10 miles, Robert left the unpaved road and began heading out into open desert, likely seeking water. Robert would eventually collapse and die just 4 days after he had been rescued from the exact same situation. When his body was found, he didn't have a GPS or a map or even a container for water. In late 2002, 25-year-old Jason Chase worked as a sheep shearer in an area called Gisborne, which is located in the northeastern section of New Zealand. When Jason wasn't working, he was often on his bike, cycling up and down the coast, preparing for his next road race. In early December of that year, Jason contacted his family, who lived in a small town called Dannevirke, which is located about 200 miles southwest of Gisborne, and he told them that he wanted to come visit them for Christmas. However, he didn't know exactly when he would actually arrive at their house, because his training and work schedule were fairly hectic, but he told them, don't worry, I will be there at least on Christmas Day, December 25th, or a couple of days earlier. His family was thrilled, and they said, no problem, we can't wait to see you whenever that is. And so by the time mid-December rolled around, and Jason still had not arrived at his family's home in Dannevirke, his family wasn't concerned at all. However, that would soon change. On December 13th, a hunter was driving along the many winding back roads of the Ruahine mountain range. This mountain range, which is located about 8 miles north of Dannevirke, is a very isolated and rugged wilderness area that's full of steep gorges and gullies and very thick brush. And so as this hunter rounds the turn on this road, he looks up ahead and he sees there's a car parked on the side of the road. And so this hunter pulls up right alongside this car and he looks over and he can tell, there's no one inside of it, there's no obvious damage to the car. And then the hunter began kind of scanning around the area to see if there was some obvious reason someone would stop right at that particular spot. But when he looked around, all he saw was thick trees on either side, and the mountain kind of sloped down on either side. And so there was nothing unique about this spot. And so something just kind of struck the hunter as odd about this car. It just seemed totally out of place. And so operating on a hunch, the hunter would leave the mountain range and head into Dannevirke, and he would contact police and he would tell them about this car and where it was located, because in the hunter's mind, maybe someone had been reported missing in the area and maybe this car is connected. And so after hearing about the car, the police did not know of any missing person cases that were connected to a car that matched the description the hunter had given. But just to be safe, the police hopped in their vehicles and they drove up into the Ruahine mountain range and they went to the spot the hunter described. And sure enough, off to the side of the road is this parked car, and it's still unoccupied. After inspecting the vehicle, the police came to the same conclusion the hunter did, that there was no obvious signs of damage to the car that might have forced someone to abandon it. And then when they looked in the window at the gas gauge, they saw the gauge was full. And so the police kind of wandered around the area, kind of doing an initial search to see if maybe the owner of this car was nearby. But there was no one there. They're in this very isolated part of this wilderness area. And so the police just took down the license plate of the car and they went back to their station. And when they got there, they ran the license plate number, and it turned out the car belonged to Jason Chase. When Jason's family was contacted about, why is Jason's car up in the Ruahine Mountains, where's Jason? His family was pretty surprised. They explained to police that Jason had made plans to come visit them around Christmas time, and so they were expecting him to come this way. And you know, the Ruahine mountain range, it is only 8 miles away from Danneberg, so you know, in theory, maybe he stopped there on the way to their house, but they told police that just didn't make any sense. So, as a precaution, the police decided to launch a search for Jason. And unfortunately, despite hundreds of people on the ground searching the Ruahine mountain range and helicopters overhead flying all over the place, no trace of Jason was found. And so the official search was called off right before Christmas, but Jason's family and friends, they continued to look for him. And on January 3rd, they would find him. One of the family friends who had agreed to continue looking for Jason after the official search had shut down was a farmer who owned a plane. And on January 3rd, as he did one of his passes over the foothills of the Ruahine mountain range, he looked down and he saw this bright red thing that looked totally out of place. And the pilot couldn't tell what it was, and so he took note of its location, and then when he landed, he passed those coordinates off to the ground team. And so the ground team, they made their way over to this location, which was quite far away from where Jason's car had been. And after making their way through some very thick brush and some very steep sections, they eventually walked out to this big open clearing. It was a dry riverbed, and right in front of them, in the middle of it, was the bright red thing. It was Jason's shirt, and Jason was still wearing it. He was found lying on his left side with his legs stretched out. He had on his bright red rugby t-shirt, some khaki shorts on, and he had no shoes or socks on. According to the searchers who first saw Jason in this dry creek bed, they would say the scene was very peaceful, and it almost looked like Jason had lied down to fall asleep. But Jason was not sleeping, he was dead. Jason had no visible injuries, and there was no sign of a struggle in the area. In fact, it didn't even look like Jason had been in the wild for very long because his clothes were pristine, and despite being barefoot, his feet were in great condition. Despite a lengthy search around the area where his body was discovered, his shoes and socks would not be recovered. The only thing they found in the area was a water bottle that belonged to Jason. Adding to the mystery of what happened to Jason were the results of his autopsy. The pathologist was unable to find any injuries. Jason also seemed well nourished because he had food in his stomach, and he was hydrated because there was urine in his bladder. His toxicology report also came back negative for all drugs, medications, and a range of common poisons. The only odd thing the pathologist found during the autopsy was that Jason had 2 very small ulcers in his duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. According to this pathologist, these type of ulcers only appear from acute stress moments before death. However, these ulcers don't indicate what caused the stress. Typically, things like severe injury or septicemia, which is blood poisoning, will cause these stress ulcers. But Jason had neither of those. So at the end of the autopsy, the pathologist concluded that Jason had not been the victim of a homicide, he had not committed suicide, he had died from, quote, obscure natural causes. Interestingly, though, the pathologist was able to determine with some certainty that Jason died on or around December 30th, which means he was alive for the entirety of the official search for him, as well as the bulk of that private search conducted by friends and family. After the autopsy results came out, Jason's case was closed, and his family, despite having lots of unanswered questions, was forced to just move on. 15 years later, the same pathologist that had conducted Jason's autopsy was talking to a colleague about Jason's case. And as he was describing where Jason was found, the colleague suddenly stopped the pathologist and said, "Wait a minute, I think I know what happened to him." And it would turn out he did. The following is a reconstruction of what happened to Jason Chase. On December 13th, 2002, Jason left his home in Gisborne and began heading south towards Danneberg, where his family lived. But before he got to his family's home, he took a detour up into the Ruahine mountain range, where he eventually parked his car on the side of the road. Once his car was stopped, he got out and collected his backpack and sleeping bag. Those were 2 items that were never discovered during the search or after his body was found, but it was later determined they were missing from his vehicle. And so after he has his pack and his sleeping bag, he also grabs a water bottle, and then he leaves the main road and begins walking into the woods, making his way down the mountain. He eventually would find a spot on the side of the mountain that he liked, and so he set up a campsite. What happens next is very confusing because we don't actually know why Jason actually went camping in the first place or when he intended to leave, but we can make one assumption. Whatever he was doing in the mountains, he planned on wrapping it up in time to still get to his family's house in Danneberg on or before Christmas Day, December 25th. So from December 13th, when he first got out of his car and entered the wilderness, until December 25th, it's believed Jason was, by choice, out in the wilderness of the Ruahine mountain range. And so as this huge search is launched for him in the area he is in, it's entirely possible that he either did not see any of the searchers. This is a very rugged